Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Deep Thoughts. And today we're talking all about Vinland Saga episode 7, Normani. Before we begin though, I do want to let you guys know that if you would like to have your name shouted out in next week's Vinland Saga video, then be sure to share this video around on the internet and then tag me at JoJo Talks Too Much over on Twitter, and I will be sure to shout you out in next week's Vinland Saga video. With that said though, we're going to jump into this week's Vinland Saga discussion, episodic discussion, whatever you want to call it, and I gotta say this time around, things are surprisingly fun. Normally when it comes to Vinland Saga, I find myself emotionally drained by the end of an episode. It always has a really strong core message about violence and war, and it usually leaves you feeling like pretty empty and usually feeling some kind of way for Thorfinn, my dear sweet boy, who is no longer a boy. Thorfinn I don't know how old Thorfinn would be by now, but like he's still a boy. He's still a lad. He's a young lad. He's not an ash lad, but he is a lad. And he has basically become a steel instrument of death. He is the Thorfinn we see in the OP at this point, where he's like running through the battlefield, flipping around. He's got his twin daggers, and he's just a total beast. That is the Thorfinn we have now, and it leads into some genuinely dope action. But before we get into what I really loved about the episode, which is namely the action, and I have a very generous, very kind comparison that I have to make for that once we get there. But first, I want to point out some things that I maybe wasn't as keen on. It's definitely, I have some negatives this week. I do very rarely have nitpicks for Vinland Saga, but this week around I do have a few. So for those of you who saw last week's video, you may remember that I had said that the language barrier last week was odd, namely since they were all speaking Japanese, and I just felt like that could have been handled better between, I believe it was the English and then the Vikings. They both spoke different languages. They weren't sure who was speaking what. It was sort of hard to understand. One couldn't speak Norse, the other one couldn't speak English, and it was just all kinds of complicated. And they were all speaking Japanese, and it was real confusing. That said, it's actually worse in this episode since they have a translator, but they're all speaking Japanese. So if you're gonna have the translator character, why not just get French voice actors? Like, given that this time it's French, there probably is some sort of like logistical reason why they couldn't bring in French voice actors. For some reason, I don't super know what it is. And even if you couldn't, I still feel like there had to have been a better way to script that scene. It's just odd. It's just a little odd. Again, not terrible, just odd. I do have another small nitpick that I just thought of now, and that's at the beginning of the episode, sort of jumps all over the place. At the beginning, we're still in England, then we jump to, I believe we're in Greenland for like half a second, and then we jump over to France. It's all sorts of kind of confusing, but in fairness, it's very brief. It only takes up, I think, maybe like the first couple minutes of the opening of the episode, so it's not a big deal. But speaking of big, and it's not a big deal, it's a big boy, and the general character really stands out amongst the other character designs, and that was likely a purposeful decision given how just darn cartoony this character looks, because he looks like he's straight out of a Looney Tunes cartoon, or just a totally different anime. Like, he looks like he does not belong here. He looks like he belongs in a way more, like I said, Looney Tunes-esque sort of anime. Like, he really doesn't fit in here at all. But I do have to question if maybe that was on purpose, given that the character's like whole thing is that he has like a crazy laugh where his jaw hinges like a snake. So I don't know. I'm torn on this one. I'm gonna count it as a negative only because that character really took me out every time I saw him on screen. I just kept, instead of focusing on the story and the characters itself, I started noticing the puppeteers in the background. Usually any good show worth its salt should try to distract you, make you think that the story and characters for a second, make you believe like it's happening. And if you start noticing the puppeteers in the background, it's usually because your mind has wandered off to other things as opposed to the show. And in my opinion, Yeah, the guy is so darn cartoony that I just had to question what the creators were doing instead of, what that character was doing. However, like I said, it's probably on purpose, and the character does lead to some relatively funny scenes. I never really laughed out loud. I was just kind of like, okay, that's neat. He has some over the top exaggerations, so I guess it's kind of fun. But enough ragging on the show, because now I just want to gush about the awesomeness of this episode, because believe it or not, for all that complaining, the episode as a whole was friggin' dope. I adore the scenery for this episode. I thought Loire River, I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, and as a Canadian, I should be fluent in French, but evidently I am not. Alas. But yeah, Loire River. Oh my goodness, tongue twister on that one. But the scenery for the fort that they take is really dope. It has this sort of autumny feel. It's in October, which is my birth month, so I was super excited about that. And I just like autumn in general. I actually can't wait for the weather to turn more chilly and have some autumn weather, and that this episode sort of reminded me of that. So I was just like, yay! I like that the trees are turning color. It sort of adds this more cool, and I don't just mean like visually cool, I mean like atmospherically cool tone to the whole thing. It was nice. I really dug this. We've seen the winter element of the show, we've seen the summer element of the show, and now we get to see a more autumny element of the show. I really dig that. The background art, I know I gush about the background art in shows like Given, but that's because I do think that's Given's greatest strength. I do think with Vinland Saga, it's one of its many strengths is its background art, and the background art in this particular episode was dope. But the big thing that I want to say about this episode, and if you know me, this is going to be a huge compliment, and it's the big takeaway from this episode for me, and that is that the battle felt very Lord of the Rings. And if it was not obvious, as a Hobbit kind of cartoon person, I quite enjoy Lord of the Rings. So for me to compare the show to Lord of the Rings, that's a big compliment. I thought that the battle in this felt very Lord of the Rings. And when I say Lord of the Rings, I don't mean the books. I mean, it felt very Peter Jackson. It felt very it was still swords and arrows and strategically setting up two separate armies warring against each other. You have people behind barricades. You have people firing arrows across over top of a fort. You have strategy on how to break into the fort. It's like a two-pronged attack between three separate groups. It felt very sort of sword. I don't want to say sword and sorcery. It just felt very medieval. But the added flair is that quote-unquote Peter Jackson flair, which is very clear here. It felt very Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, because Askeladd and the gang just straight up carry their boats across the battlefield while Askeladd literally screams as though he were riding the boat into battle, which he was when you think about it. And it was that plus that POV attack, the way when Thorfinn charges in to take the head of the captain so that he can have his rematch with Askeladd. It was this mix of gritty medieval combat mixed with this over the top flair. And if you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies, you know what I'm talking about. And this sort of flair mixed with this almost goofy action. I don't want to say goofy because then that's people are gonna think it's a detraction, and it's not. It's this sort of acrobatic flair that certain characters have. Not all the soldiers have the same flair. Only the super special soldiers like Aragorn and Legolas, and in this case Askeladd and Thorfinn. I loved it. I thought it was so friggin' cool. And Askeladd's looking like a straight up boss with his kingly attire. It's just Askeladd as a character is probably gonna be my favorite quote unquote antagonist. He is still the antagonist as far as I'm concerned. At least that's where what I'm seeing in terms of the story. I know that Thorfinn is technically hanging out with Askeladd and listening to his orders, so he's not technically an antagonist. I've seen people argue that Askeladd shouldn't be labeled as an antagonist, but he is still the hurdle to overcome in this story thus far. I'm sure the story's going to change, and the Askeladd and Thorfinn dynamic will likely change with said story. But for right now, Askeladd is the antagonist, and in these past couple episodes, he has been one of my favorite antagonists to watch on screen this entire season. And I kind of hope he keeps the kingly attire because he looks friggin' dope. So with that said, I had sort of mulled over what grade to give this week's episode, and I'm gonna stick with a B+. I think overall, the episode had some amazing action, and I do feel like this is the one episode I could probably rewatch on a loop and still enjoy every time. But it just felt like it didn't have the same emotional resonance that the other ones did. It had a couple hiccups here and there that sort of kept it from a grade of A. I do feel like I've been a little too lenient with many shows like this season and previous seasons where I give too many A's, so I want to be a little bit more strict. And it's very close to an A- because I do think the action is fantastic. But because of the couple hiccups here and there and the overall story of the episode, I feel comfortable with the B+, and I still think it was really great. But hey, before we finish up today's video, as always, I have to give a big shout out to the good folks over on Patreon, namely those in the Earl Grey tier: Calvin Atkinson, Crowbar of Irony, Dominic, Urza, No For Nothing, Maria Teresa, Mirth Mouser, Nye, Omnigaramond, Opinionated Slime, Cell, Shadow Creative, Sipco Games, Somastan, Tristan, and Veridin. Thank you guys so much for your continued support over on Patreon, and if you too would like to join the T Squadron, then by all means go ahead and check out the Patreon link in the description. Check out our Patreon exclusive Discord and all the other cool rewards you can get over there. And yeah, that is gonna do it for today's video, so I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, then you've probably been on the internet long enough to know what to do already, so I ain't gonna tell you, but I will say that it is appreciated. And if you're feeling stressed out today, you go have yourself a warm cup of tea, and I'll talk to you all again real soon.